So this is a tale of two Joshes, Josh Brettel, Josh Payne. I don't think they'll mind me talking about them. These are two of my Pathfinder coaching students who are part of the Rooftop community, part of the Spartans Rising community, the men's leadership piece as well. And they have done enormous work in the realm of storytelling, and neither of them have been with me for that long. The first guy, Josh Brettel, who lives up in Chicago, he has been diving deep on the stories that he tells in the practice of his wealth management practice, right? And it's a family-owned business, and Josh has had success in that his whole life. But when we first started working together, one of the things that he said to me was, Scott, I don't know if my story is powerful enough to do what I want it to do. I look at all these other people who have these epic stories, and I just don't feel like I have an epic story. And then Josh Page, who owns an electrical contracting company, does very well up in the Northeast. Josh was coming in and he felt like he had a story, but he was trying to figure out, how do I make this work in the hard-nosed world of contracting, right? Where results are everything, and it's very technical, very left brain, very rough type environment. How do I make my story a relevant strategic tool in how I lead my business? Two very valid questions from two very squared away leaders, Rooftop leaders. I set those stories up as context for questions that I hear all the time. I've trained hundreds, if not thousands, of leaders in the use of story, from everything from spinal cord injury nonprofit centers that have raised $1.4 million to Fortune 100 commercial banks who use story to convey their vision to their associates and to explain to their clients how their product is different. I've used story training to train Green Berets in federal law enforcement. And these questions come up all the time. In fact, I've probably trained story across more disciplines than most people out there, to include the development of the story and the use of the story. And that's because I learned storytelling in one of the hardest environments in the world, which is tribal society, at risk and undergoverned, and really on the edges of tribal warfare. That's where I learned storytelling as a Green Beret, to go in and make human connections across vast trust gaps that, if we got them wrong, could mean life, death, mission failure at a strategic level. So the understanding of high stakes storytelling, of purposeful storytelling, of rooftop storytelling, stories that would give the listener, the skeptical listener, slowly caressing the trigger of his AK-47 while he looked at you, enough of a sense of you and enough of a sense of himself that he would follow you up that ladder into the darkness when the village is under attack. That kind of storytelling. And again, I've shared it across multiple disciplines, and I've heard them all. I've heard all kinds of reasons and myths surrounding story. And so as we dive deep into this month in July, and you start to arm yourself with the power of story, of narrative competence, of the integration of storytelling, active listening, and interpersonal skills to form deep connections, human connections that meet your goals and the goals of the other party, you've really got to know what the myths are. Let's just take them on head on, right? And if I miss any, I'm going to ask you to let me know in this thread right here. Put your questions about story or your pushback on story, put them in here and we'll address them. Wes is off camera here. He or Jamie will make sure that we get them and that we address them back to the community. But here's kind of the top 5 that I hear, all right? The first one is, I don't have a story. Kind of like what Josh had. I mean, Josh had a story, but he didn't feel like it was worthy of the dream that he had for his practice to reach exponential levels, right? Well, come to find out, Josh absolutely had a story, right? But he was gauging his story against everybody else. We can't do that, right? That's why some of these story workshops I feel like are actually kind of counterproductive, because all around you are these epic stories of special operators and athletes who have overcome adversity, right? And even soccer moms, right, who've lifted their van, or soccer dads who have lifted their van above their head and rescued their child. I mean, those are great stories, right? And maybe you have one of those, but not everyone has that kind of epic story. And that doesn't mean, right, that you don't have a story. As I explained in the last podcast of how stories work, our brains function around story. So the notion that you don't have a story is a myth, right? If I were to ask you to turn to someone you care about and tell them your best memory of the last holiday season, what was your best memory, you'd be able to do that. Now, Wes off camera here, he could do that right away. It'd probably be an X-rated version of the story. I'm kidding. But we all have them, right? And so we are storytelling animals. We are homo narratus, as Kendall Page says. So the problem, and we got to watch this, is that you don't self-judge or self-edit your story before you bring it into the world, right? Because that is a whole different thing. But you do have stories, and you do have stories that are potentially powerful. As an aside, Josh Brettel ended up telling a story of his son's seizure when he was a young kid that is immensely powerful. And he didn't think about it till he got around this fire, out in the woods, his toes uncurled, and he was able to connect with it. Number two, stories are obsolete in the world of social media and digital communication. I'm sure there's people that would like to believe that. Simply not true, right? We've only had social media to this caliber for about 10 years. The iPhone's 10 years old, right? The internet, I don't know, what, 20, 25 years? But we have been telling stories for 100,000 years. And as Sebastian Junger says in his book, Tribe, external influences on our cellular biology, it takes 25,000 years for those to manifest, right? So by my country boy math, that's not going to be anytime soon. Stories will be relevant for the rest of our lifetime. The best stories, if you're going to use social media, are how you embed them in your social media, right? How do you tell a story in Twitter? How do you tell a story in Instagram? And this whole notion of just labeling a heading as stories and then putting pictures in there, that ain't a story, right? That's not a story. It's laziness. But you can use stories in social media. But social media does not render story obsolete. And the person who thinks that is on the march of they're obsolete. They're on the march of the dinosaur. The storytellers who understand social media as well will rule the world in the 21st century. You can write that one down. The third myth is stories don't apply to my world. They don't apply to commercial banking. They don't apply to the world of special operations where I have to, gun up on people. Stories don't apply to a steel factory floor. Stories don't apply, as Josh Page said, maybe in the world of electrical contracting. I will tell you that if stories apply in tribal societies where people are killing each other with shovels over water, they apply everywhere else, right? Because we come from storytelling. We're hardwired for storytelling. We've just covered it all up with a bunch of contractual, transactional BS, right? And we tell ourselves that stories aren't relevant because we're afraid. Because we know that telling a story properly requires us to give of ourselves. It requires what I call the generosity of scars, right? To share our journey with others so that they can learn from our journey and be relevant in their world. That's why we say that. But the reality is, again, if you believe that one, you're rendering yourself irrelevant, and the storyteller who's your competitor is going to run circles around you. Stories are relevant in every discipline. They're not the silver bullet, but they are always relevant in most forms of communication. And if you dive deep into the practice, you can do like Josh Page is doing right now, and he's killing it right now. He's speaking to technical trade associations and schoolhouses and using story to do it. He's using story with his clients, and he's even about to launch a podcast, right, that is going to talk about how contractors can play a more responsible role for their clients. Guess who's going to be getting more business soon? Number 4. Stories are personal and unprofessional. Stories are personal, and sometimes they're uncomfortable, right? And so as a result of that, there are leaders out there who think that that makes you unprofessional by sharing that. Not true. What's personal is universal, right? That's an old saying. And Bo Eason says it, but there's folks before him that say it. What's personal is universal. What's personal to Wes when he tells his story of when he was in the heyday of making music and rock, it's personal to me. He and I sat around the fire pit not that long ago, and he was sharing those stories, and you could tell, man, he was transformed. He was back there, and I was there with him. I was loving every second of it. I was like a little 8-year-old kid, right? There is always a need for the personal nature of story, and when you do that, when it means something to you, that social mechanism that is semi-conscious in us at an oxytocin kind of level, it causes us to trust you. When you have the generosity of scars to bear your miles and struggles and lessons, we can't help but connect with you, right? And number 5, my story isn't good enough. This goes back to Josh Brettle's perspective. That is self-judgment. That is getting in your head. That has nothing to do with the story. In fact, it's a disservice to the people who could benefit from the story. Because I will tell you now, when Josh Brettle tells the story of his son and his seizure to future prospects, guess what the first question is after they sign with him? And they do sign with him at about an 85% rate when he was at 50. How's your son? Enough said. Join us at rooftopleadership.com/mastery if you want to learn how to bust these myths and become a master storyteller in your life and business. We've been doing it for a long time, and we've got a community that does it well. For what you spend eating out once a month, you can become part of this tribe and learn this right at home for a really reasonable amount, and without having to travel. So join us, rooftopleadership.com/mastery. Bust the myths of story, get competent in narrative, own your life, own your story. I'll see you on the rooftop.